Hello, all of my history-loving friends. This is Madam Morbid. I am your guide on any number of historical adventures. Today we're going to finish the story of the Young brothers and the massacre that took the lives of 6 police officers. This is part 4 of what is going to be a 5-part series. And you're going to want to watch all of them. I'm going to make this episode assuming you've watched the others. But I am going to give just a little bit of a synopsis of the first ones, just to kind of jog your memory a little bit. The Young family originally came from Christian County, Ozark, Missouri. They lived in Oklahoma for a while and had come back. Their boys were now adults or young adults. Harry was their youngest. And they had begun a criminal career. Robbing, stealing. They'd done time in prison. Jennings, Paul, and Harry were the worst of the bunch. There may have been something going on with Harry's mental health. He was the most violent of all of them, and he had actually murdered a police constable in Republic, Missouri, and was wanted for that murder. After that happened, he fled. Harry and Jennings had started a massive car theft ring. They went to Texas where they would steal the cars, and then they would take them to other states and sell them there. The sheriff was kind of on to Harry. He had a tip about a man who had been accused of car theft, but he had actually bought the stolen car from Harry. Sheriff Marcel Hendricks decided to lure him back to town. He started this rumor that he wasn't looking for Harry anymore, that he thought he had skipped the country and was nowhere to be found. This rumor got back to Harry, and just as the sheriff hoped, he then thought it was safe to come home and visit. They rolled into town in early January in a stolen car. And it was when they were trying to sell this car that word got back to the police, hey, Jennings and Harry Young are back in Springfield. They're visiting their mom over at the farmhouse in Brookline. The sheriff maybe got a little excited and wanted to go straight over there and try to get them. And it would go horrendously. Jennings and Harry both were excellent shots. Sheriff Marcel Hendricks and Deputy Wiley Mashburn went around the side of the house to the kitchen door, where they were met with a blast from Harry's shotgun. Sheriff Hendricks was hit in the chest, and Wiley Mashburn took a direct hit to his face. The brothers then went to the front windows of the house, where with his rifle, Jennings, with the efficiency of a military sniper, took out each and every man, one by one. 4 had escaped with their lives, barely. 3 of those 4 were wounded. Virgil Johnson and Ben Blue escaped in a car, got back to the station, screaming they needed help, they needed ammunition, everybody is shot, everybody's dead. They got that ammunition and headed back to the house. And this is where we're going to start our story. It was a really ragtag group of guys who gathered outside this house. You're seeing footage of the house here. It has this long lane. Then there's the house with the barn over to the side. Everybody's sitting there thinking, whoever's in there killed the sheriff. They killed Tony Oliver. They killed Ollie Crosswhite. These are 3 of the toughest guys they know. Ollie would fight anybody. Ollie was a huge, tough guy. He was tall. He had these massive hands, and he wasn't afraid of anything, at least that it would appear to other people. Tony Oliver had taken down Dob Adams. It happened a few years before. Dob Adams had gone on a rampage. He killed his wife's friend. He killed his mother-in-law. He attacked his sister-in-law. Luckily, she survived. Then he had barricaded himself in a house. He had killed a police officer, and Tony had taken him in alone when everybody else fled. Like a group of 10 officers fled. Again, a tough guy. The crowd outside that house had to have been thinking, what in the world can I do against these people? Whoever's in there is terrifying. There were car dealers, farmers, merchants, low-level police officers all gathered at the end of this driveway, trying to figure out what to do, and terrified they're going to get killed. There is no leader. Chief of Police Ed Waddle did not come, for whatever reason. There was one man in the crowd, though, who had the courage to go toward the house. His name was Lon Scott. He was a veteran of the Great War. Formerly, he had been a reporter for the New York Times, and he used to be a member of the National US 66 Highway Association. In that organization, his job was to publicize Route 66. And in doing so, he came up with ideas like the Bunyan Derby. It was a transcontinental foot race, the first half being on Route 66 from California all the way to New York City. Just running. It was a distance of 3,422 miles. 275 people paid $100 to try to win the $25,000 prize money. This sounds like one of the most miserable, awful, horrendous things. I cannot imagine signing up for this on purpose. If the race took 87 days and 573 hours of running. Oh, God. Anyway, there was a winner, and the prize money did change this person's life. He was also instrumental in negotiating with the federal government in making Wilson's Creek Battlefield a national park. And here he was, risking his life just like he had it during the Great War. Lon used his military training. One of the first things you want to do is scout the area before making any kind of attack. He went up on a little hill, and I know exactly what hill they're talking about because when I was there filming the location, I wanted to film the back of the house. But this hill blocks your view. You would literally have to climb this hill to see the backyard, and I did not do that. If I couldn't see it from the road, I didn't film it. But once you climb up there, you have a perfect view of the back of the house. And from that vantage point, he could see an open door. This is the kitchen door. And he also saw a chicken house and a pole pile. And he decided the best place for him to try to get was that pole pile. But he did want somebody to come with him. So he returned to the mouth of the driveway and approached a detective named Howard Lee Jones, and everybody called him Lee. At this point, ambulances have come in. More people have come to either help or just watch. But literally nobody's going anywhere near the house. They were all standing there, hoping somebody else would go toward the house so they wouldn't have to. Lon Scott went up to Detective Jones and said, "Lee, how much guts have you got?" And Lee said back, "By God, as much as you have." Lee Jones was upset he had been left out of the raid to begin with. He assumed he was going to be going. But he used to be a barber. And instead, he was ordered to go to the hospital to cut the hair of an officer, Oscar Lowe, who was in the hospital. I don't know if he'd been hurt in the line of duty or if he was just sick. And he was really ticked off about it. What in the world am I doing here doing this silly stuff when they're out there taking down this massive gang? So as far as he's concerned, this is his chance to make up for the fact that he wasn't there. This time they both go back to the same crest. They're in a cornfield, but it probably isn't protecting them very much because it's January. So Lon Scott takes off toward the pole pile and immediately trips and falls right on his face. And it's while he's laying there that he hears a noise. He says he laid there anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. I doubt it was that long. When you're in a situation like that, I feel like time seems infinite. 2 minutes could seem like 10. He said he heard this noise every few seconds. While he's laying there, Lee Jones hollers to him, "Is that you, Scott?" And he hollered back, "Where are you, Lee?" He said, "I'm in the cornfield. Where are you?" He said, "I'm by the pole pile." What do we do?" And Lon said, "Let's run for the chicken house." "Is anybody in it?" "No." They crouched down and they ran toward the chicken house. They still don't see anybody or anything. Lon Scott asked Lee for his shotgun. And he says, "All right, but there's only one shell and I haven't any more ammunition. Give me your rifle." So they exchange weapons. The rifle was a bolt action, and he moved the bolt back and went to cock it. He held the rifle up, pulled the trigger, and nothing happened. He said, "That is a damn fine gun to have in a place like this." Scott said, "Let me have it." He tried and realized it had a broken trigger. He said, quote, "So we were on the spot with one shotgun shell between us. We might as well have a crate of tomatoes. Or a couple of ice cream cones." They dashed for the pole pile anyway. On their hands and knees behind the pole pile, again they heard the And that's when they crawled to the east end of the pole pile and saw poor Wiley Mashburn sitting there at the back door, rocking back and forth. Lon Scott had been in the Great War, and he described Wiley Mashburn's wound as, quote, the most ghastly wound that has ever been my experience to look upon. So now they know this is a friend. They've been so scared of whoever this was, and it was one of their friends who's sitting there and dying. Now they're not afraid anymore. They just holler out for help. And from the end of the lane, the response at first is, go to hell. But enough guys get the courage to finally hop on the running board of the ambulance and drive down to the house to rescue Wiley Mashburn. Constable Scott Curtis deputized everybody in the crowd. He said, quote, I'm a constable. I'm Constable Scott Curtis. I'm a little out of my township, but I guess you won't mind. I'm deputizing every one of you men with rifles or shotguns or any other guns. We've got to spread out through these cornfields and find these killers. We'll find them if I have to track them the rest of my life. They had sent for a machine gun, and a lot of people wanted to wait for that machine gun to arrive before they approached the house. When they heard Lon Scott yelling for help, he took that as reason to move toward the house. Frank Rhodes was a Springfield newspaper reporter. He was walking down the lane with a contractor, Ralph Langdon, and a dairyman, E.L. Bun Barrett. Langdon had a rifle he'd borrowed from somebody, and all Bun had was a flashlight. Rhodes said as they approached the house, it was completely dark, the moon was out, and after walking about 15 feet, he tripped on something, which turned out to be the body of Tony Oliver. 15 to 20 feet away from that, he could see Charlie Hauser. Bun Barrett shone his flashlight over in that direction, and with that light, they could see Sidney Meadows lying right beside him. Everybody's on edge. Lon Scott comes out of the darkness, sees Frank Rhodes, tells him to put his hands up. They realize they're friends. Lon Scott and Lee Jones are dragging Wiley. He was too heavy for them to lift. And I also think Lee Jones was a little afraid to touch him. He got a little, well, this is, of course, Scott's version, but he says Lee Jones was basically begging him, do something. Pick him up, save him, he's dying. He wanted somebody to save him, but he didn't want to have to be the one to interact with someone in such horrible shape. But as more people arrive, they then lift him up. It takes about 4 people, and they hand him over the fence to Frank Rhodes and Bun Barrett and Mr. Langdon, and they get him into the ambulance, which has finally driven up. And Lon Scott says that's the last he saw of him. He would die in the hospital at 10:30 that night. From around the back of the house comes a man named J.T. Holtzman. He owned an oil company. He had filling stations around Springfield. He was originally from Arkansas. While in the back of the house, he had found Ollie Crosswhite by the cellar. They tell him to put his hands up. The only person they hadn't found was Sheriff Marcel Hendricks. They had seen a door open at the back of the house, but that actually was a door to a little utility room. The door inside that was barricaded shut, and I described how they did that in the last video. Some people were so freaked out they were saying, let's just torch the place. No, we're not going to do that. They didn't know if Hendricks was still alive. When it came to break down the door, Curtis had a revolver. Someone with him had a shotgun. He asked the guy with the shotgun to fire through the door. He did that. After that, they run to the door. It's locked. Curtis kicks it several times, trying to break it in. After it was open, Lee Jones fired the gas gun a couple of times, and that prevented them entering the house because the gas was so horrible. Curtis said they went in and exited several times before it was cleared out enough that they could get in there. He said, quote, finally, we got in the back room. I didn't ever find anyone until I got in the southwest room in the kitchen. I found Mr. Hendricks on the south side of the room. His face was facing north with his legs crossed. There was a little stack of wood there. His head was lying across this wood. I felt of him and seen that he was dead. I don't suppose there was over a half-dozen flashlights in the crowd. When we lifted Mr. Hendricks up, someone had a light. My boy was with me. He's referring to his son, Howard. We got hold of him and got him out the door. Marcel Hendricks had started his day in Ash Grove, where he took down a ring of bootleggers. He stood in the middle of the street, pouring liquor down the street drains. And this is how his day had ended. After examining all of the bodies, Coroner Murray Stone determined that 3 weapons had caused everybody's injuries. 2 rifles, one slightly bigger caliber than the other, and a shotgun. Later on, this is changed. In the end, they believe only 2 weapons were used in this. The brothers had borrowed them from their brother Oscar, and these guns are going to be instrumental in getting them caught. More on that later. The people of Springfield were absolutely terrified. People descended on the hardware stores. They bought tons of guns and weapons. People who were never even interested in guns got them out and loaded them to have them ready, just in case. The next day was Sunday. Religious leaders in town had to scrap whatever sermon they had planned. They had to address what has just happened. For the most part, they tried to calm their congregations, urging them to not become vigilantes, and of course praising the heroism of the 6 men who had been killed. Sightseers swarmed on the farmhouse just to get a glimpse of where it all happened. They weren't allowed in the house, but people wandered all around the crime scene. They were sticking their fingers in bullet holes in the maple trees. The police had a fence around the house, kind of a makeshift one, because at some point a little kid disappeared. They thought he was missing, and it turned out he had gotten through that somehow and was found inside the house. I mean, they had bloodhounds to try to track the guys down, but so many people had tramped all over everything. There was really nothing the poor dogs could do. If you look at photographs of this crowd, notice how many of them are dressed in their Sunday best, because they went straight from church to the crime scene. 2 truckloads of National Guard troopers arrived to hunt those cornfields. People were on edge so much. One National Guard trooper actually took a shot at an animal, just shot into the cornfield thinking it was one of the Young brothers. Someone remarked, I was more afraid of being shot by the mob than the Young brothers. Vehicles were being stopped and searched. There were all these rumors. There were tunnels under the house, that's how the guys had escaped. And to this day, people are curious as to whether there are tunnels under the house. The short answer is no. There is 0 evidence of tunnels. Other rumors and speculation included, Pretty Boy Floyd was there. No, it was one of the Barker boys. There were 3 killers. No, there must have been 4 killers. Maybe even more than that. There were sightings of them in Kansas City, Iowa, Oklahoma. A strange man called jailer Frank Willie at the Greene County Jail and said, hey, that deal out at the Young farmhouse, how many police officers died in that? Frank swore he was talking to Harry Young. Now, I doubt this was actually Harry. The call came from Kansas City. We know where the guys went. They headed toward Texas. So a call from Kansas City doesn't make any sense. They also knew how many had died because they had robbed all of them as they left. They took Marcel Hendricks' gun. They took Wiley Mashburn's gun. They took some things from the sheriff's wallet. So they knew how many. They'd seen them and gone through their pockets. It was probably just a cruel prank. It was a bad time to be a stranger, especially if it was 2 guys. Police went out to a call near Brookline. There were 2 guys in this lady's backyard. They asked her for breakfast, but they swore they weren't the guys they were looking for, and they weren't. But people were so on edge, someone opened fire on a chicken coop, thinking there were bad guys inside it, and all they did was kill some poor innocent hens. Members of the Young family were brought in and put in jail. Oscar and his wife Mabel. A posse made a raid on Ma Young's brother's house, Judd Hagewood, out in Bird Eye. People started telling these stories about how good these guys were with guns. Stuff like, Harry could hit a $50 piece at 50 yards 39 out of 40 times. He could shoot 50 walnuts off a tree without changing his stance. He could throw marbles in the air and shoot them to bits. He'd been barred from turkey shoots because he was too good and they wanted other people to be able to win. Actually, Jennings was the one who was such a good shot. It seems like Jennings did most of the sniping, while Harry had a shotgun and did his deeds at close range. Then there came a huge break in the case. Our story now moves to Streetman, Texas. It's about 70 miles south of Dallas. At the time, it had a population of about 500 people. It's about half of that today. And the main industry was farming. On this day, it's Sunday, and a farmer named Hillary Dean Carroll witnesses a pretty bad car wreck in front of his house. Hillary was about 53 years old. He lived at the corner of Corsicana and Streetman streets. Streetman, the town, was located basically on the county line between Navarro County and Freestone County, Texas. According to newspaper accounts, the wreck occurred, quote, near the county line. Mr. Carroll lived on the Navarro County side. The name of the streets have changed. I was trying to find exactly where he lived, but there is no Corsicana Street and there is no Streetman Street anymore. There is, however, County Line Street, which intersects at a highway. And this may be where he lived. If you are from Streetman and know what used to be Streetman and Corsicana, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I'm definitely speculating here. Could also be further north. It all depends on what your definition of near is. It's very vague. But even today, County Line Road is just an unpaved dirt road. And even this present day Highway 416 was unpaved in 1932. The car was a 1931 Ford Coupe. It had been stolen from Harry Rogers Motor Company, located on Commercial Street. He had been moving cars around. This car was probably parked in the street, likely with the keys still inside. The guys hopped in and took it. The boys had run so fast they didn't have time to switch the license plate. They were approaching Mr. Carroll's farmhouse at an extremely high rate of speed. The car slowly drifted off the road and flipped over when it finally hit a ditch high enough to just flip the car. My suspicion is whoever was driving had fallen asleep. Mr. Carroll ran up to the car. 2 men crawled out of the wreckage. The car would no longer run. He described them as being 35 to 40 years old. One was bald, with a fringe of light-colored hair. They were about the same height, about the same weight. Harry had a gash in his scalp above his forehead, and he was injured in his right hip. Carroll could see blood showing through his torn trousers. And he thought he'd got these injuries in the wreck. He didn't say anything about injuries on Jennings. It's interesting, he thought Jennings was the younger brother. And I think it was the hair loss and just the perpetual sour look on his face made Harry look older. He said Harry was wearing a dark hat, light trousers, and a gray overcoat. He described Jennings as wearing a white hat, dark suit, and gray overcoat. Mr. Carroll said, "Are you boys all right? Do you need any help? Let me go get my mule team and we'll pull this car out of that ditch there." They waved him away. They kept refusing help. No, we're fine. But Mr. Carroll didn't listen. He went to his barn to go get the team. And by the time he got back, the 2 men were gone. But his family had seen what had happened. Through the window, the family watched as they removed the license plate and threw it into the field. They then flagged down a car, headed south, and disappeared. Hillary came up with the mule team. He was suspicious, but it wasn't until he got inside the car that he actually called authorities. He went to the field, found the license plate, and inside the car, he found 2 guns. A Remington 12-gauge hammerless pump shotgun, number U171542. It contained 5 good shells and 1 discharged hull. And a Remington 25-20 repeating pump rifle, number AA5739, containing 2 cartridges. The license plate was a Missouri plate 363662, which is how they were able to identify it as that stolen car. With this information, Mr. Carroll got on the phone and called authorities in Freestone and Navarro counties. But nobody seemed to really take him all that seriously. What made the difference is the operator he talked to, a woman named Lila Cook Gaddy, got enough information from him about what had happened that she was telling her family about it that night. And her adult son had avidly been listening to the radio and knew all about the case in Missouri. And he instantly recognized these 2 men as sounding like those Missouri suspects. He didn't bother with local authorities. He called Springfield, Missouri. He talked to prosecuting attorney Dan Nee. The weapons he described sounded just like what the coroner thought had been used. They arranged for Texas authorities to bring those weapons to them, and they thought they were headed toward Houston, which was 170 miles south of Streetman. So they contacted Houston police, who started searching for them in Houston. And at the same time, they're also getting information out of the brothers' sisters that they have in custody, Vanita and Lorena. They find out from them that Harry has gotten married again to a woman named Florence Calvert, that he had been living under the name Claude Walker in Houston, Texas. So this abandoned car, with these 2 suspects matching their description, heading toward Houston, now this all starts to make sense. Harry is headed to Houston to pick up his wife. Now police in Houston have something to go on. They're not only questioning young family members who live in Houston, they're also talking to Florence Calvert's family, who report that Harry has been there recently looking for her. They also start tracking this Claude Walker, going to where he lived. When they talk to Harry's sister, her name was Florence, interestingly, she tells them, "I haven't seen my brothers, but they are desperate, and they will not be taken alive." It's now Monday, January 4th, 1932, in Springfield, Missouri. At the courthouse, not much happened that day. According to the newspapers, if it wasn't absolutely vital, nobody worked that day. People were coming and going. They were going to the funerals. They were going to visit families who had lost loved ones. The deputy county clerk, Lori Acton, collected money on behalf of the people working in the courthouse to have flowers sent to all 6 funerals. She went from officer to officer and collected $71.60. The second floor was hit the hardest because that's where Sheriff Hendricks's office had been. So every day they saw the sheriff and the deputies. Deputy R.E. Hodge was bitter. He was bitter that they were dead, and he told multiple people, quote, "I wish I had been there." Today, we call that survivor's guilt. I think the saddest story happened in the circuit clerk's office. Early that morning, blood-soaked court papers that had been found in Wiley Mashburn's pockets were in the office to be recopied. They were divorce papers. It seems he probably intended to serve them shortly before the raid. Then everything happened so quickly and he had just put them in his pocket to be done later. Irene Harper Wilson, the deputy clerk, had to copy them. The paper said she, quote, almost wept as she copied the tragic document. Early that morning, Maud Hendricks, the widow of Marcel Hendricks, was appointed the temporary sheriff of Greene County to fulfill the unexpired term of her husband. Around noon, she went to the sheriff's office to take the formal oath of office. She then reappointed all of her husband's deputies: R.E. Hodge, chief deputy; W. Ed Smith, office deputy; Frank Wiley, the jailer; and J. Will Webb, probation officer. A special election would be held January 26th to choose a permanent replacement. Maud ran for that office. She lost to Scott Curtis by 34 votes. Interestingly, the newspaper gave a glimpse inside the house. Curious people were still gathering at the crime scene. And obviously everybody wanted to know what it was like inside the house. So the Springfield newspaper decided to let everybody know. First of all, it had been completely ransacked. It said the only thing still in the place where the family probably put it were the piano and the stove in the kitchen. Feather mattresses had been ripped apart, so there were feathers everywhere. Every single drawer in the house was open or dumped or rifled through. The paper said, quote, "The house was furnished in a comfortable but commonplace way, as any average farmhouse might be. There was little color, everything verging on a grayness. The papered walls, the rugs on the floor, the overstuffed furniture and scarves on the piano. The beds were of iron, the books were few. In the leaves of a school book of Robert L. Stevenson's Travels with a Donkey was folded a clipping out from the Springfield Leader of the death of Rudolph Valentino and a picture of the screen actor. Heaped on dresser tops were things taken from the drawers, handkerchiefs, ties, a gold-rimmed pair of glasses, several yards of pink muslin, a cheap, empty purse, and a world of stuff in such confusion that it would take hours to sort it out. The very first funeral was held Monday at 11 a.m. It happened at Starn Mortuary at the corner of Market and Walnut Street. It was the funeral of Ollie Crosswhite. By 11 o'clock, at least 400 people had crowded into the building. Only some of them found seats. People were standing in the aisles and filled absolutely every hallway and vestibule. Ollie had a gray casket that was heaped with flowers and wreaths. The room was just full of uniforms and police badges from all of the law enforcement officers past and present who had served with Ollie. Several judges were in attendance. The former mayor, W.E. Freeman, was there. The pastor of the Baptist Church at Walnut Grove, J.F. Sherman, led the service. Reverend Sherman said, quote, "I knew Ollie Crosswhite as a boy, and I have known him as a man. He has served in a valiant way, always standing between danger and us. He gave his life to protect our homes. We are brought face to face with this terrible tragedy that death is real and death is certain." There was a second service for him in Walnut Grove, and that's where he's buried in a just beautiful cemetery. It's like something from a picture postcard. The next funeral was that of Wiley Mashburn, which happened at 2 o'clock that same afternoon at the Alma Lohmeyer Funeral Home. Was one of the first female licensed morticians in the country. The current Lohmeyer Funeral Home was opened by her nephews, and their careers began by working for her. John Killian, an evangelist, said during his funeral, where a crowd of about 500 people gathered, quote, "The shooting was far worse than gang slayings of Chicago, in that city bandits kill bandits. But here, 6 of our best men, our bravest and most courageous men, law-abiding citizens, were put to death by bandits." Wiley Mashburn was laid to rest at East Lawn Cemetery. East Lawn offered a free plot to all 6 families. 3 took advantage of that: Wiley Mashburn's family, Sid Meadows' family, and Sheriff Marcel Hendricks' family. Wiley and Sid Meadows were buried side by side, and Sheriff Hendricks was not far from where they were located. The final funeral that Monday was that of Chief of Detectives Tony Oliver. I'm here at Grant Avenue Baptist Church. Detective Tony Oliver's funeral was held here on January 4th, 1932. The procession, taking his body from the funeral home on Walnut Street to the Grant Avenue Baptist Church you see before you, was 2.5 blocks long. At least 600 people crowded into the church. He was in a gray casket with simple bronze fittings, and it was covered with one large floral piece. It was carried by 6 policemen: James Estes, P.R. Hyde, Riley Bolerjack, Frank Pike, Grover White, and Owen Brown. 2 had been with him when he was killed, Frank and Owen. The altar was covered with flowers. One was from the police department, and another was from the courthouse. Reverend Thomas Houston Wiles gave the sermon. He said, quote, "We need more men in our community in office for the protection of our homes, like Tony Oliver." He continued, "Tony Oliver was a loyal friend, a true husband, and a devoted father." A quartet sang Rock of Ages. Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. Myrtle Anderson sang the old rugged cross. I'll cherish the old rugged cross. Then, led by a procession of motorcycles, Tony Oliver was transported to Hazelwood Cemetery, where he was laid to rest. There were 2 funerals on Tuesday, Sidney Meadows and the Sheriff Marcel Hendricks. I was able to find very little about Sidney Meadows' funeral. It actually makes me sad because I could find so much on everybody else. It was held at the Floyd Fox Funeral Home at 2:45. It was delayed slightly so it didn't interfere with Sheriff Hendricks' funeral. Fellow police officers served as his pallbearers. Grover White, Frank Pike, Virgil Johnson, Owen Brown, Lee Jones, and Jim Hale. Frank, Virgil, and Owen were all on the raid, and Lee Jones was the one who helped rescue Wiley Mashburn, and that's all they say. I don't know how many people attended. I don't know who led the services, but he was taken to East Lawn Cemetery and laid to rest next to Wiley Mashburn, who had been buried the day before. The papers claimed that in the days leading up to his funeral, the body of Sheriff Marcel Hendricks was viewed by more than 5,000 people. His body was prepared by Klingner Funeral Home. Many people filed through to see him there. Then he was taken to his home, where lots of people called on the family. Before his funeral, he was taken to the American Legion. The building you see before you is the American Legion Hall, post 69. It's been here since about 1919, 1920. A huge crowd had gathered here by 12:30 when the doors opened. Legion members ushered people through this main hallway, down this little staircase, into, the paper called it an auditorium. It's more of a meeting room. He lay here at the east end of the room. This kitchen area and all of this has been added. The Legion pallbearers stood at attention behind his bier. It was surrounded by 10 flags, 5 American flags, and 5 representing veterans groups. At the head of the casket stood a member in a Marines uniform. At the foot stood a member in a naval uniform. For 2 hours, a constant procession of citizens from all walks of life paid their respects. People wore everything from business suits to overalls. The Legion estimated 2,000 people went through in that 2-hour period. Then Legion members made a double line to pay their respects as the casket was carried to the hearse. From there, he was taken to the First Baptist Church. The building that stands there today was built in 1951. It's much larger than the church that was there in the 30s. It could not accommodate everybody who wanted to attend the funeral. Many people were turned away. Anyone who couldn't get inside stood outside, and they broadcast the funeral over a PA system so that people could hear it. I think this is why they didn't say hardly anything about Sidney Meadows' funeral. It was simply overshadowed by the sheriff's. Reverend Lewis M. Hale led the service. He was the reverend of the First Baptist Church at the time. Only one stained glass window remains from the original structure. What does remain is the pulpit, where Reverend Hale would have stood. At the beginning of the service, R.D. Patterson of Grant Avenue Baptist Church sang "Life is Like a Railroad." He had also sang at Tony Oliver's funeral.
Life is like a mountain railroad with an engineer that's brave. We must make the run successful from the cradle to the grave.
Clella Biles played the organ. Reverend Thomas Houston Wiles of Grant Avenue Baptist Church led the invocation. A men's quartet from Grant Avenue Baptist Church sang "Home of the Soul." There we shall rest, never to... Reverend Hale said, quote, "Marcel Hendricks is not dead. You take it from me. Marcel Hendricks on last Saturday began to live in a larger way than ever before. When they took Jesus Christ down from Calvary, they thought he was dead. Now, 2,000 years later, millions of people follow him. He would have been forgotten had he not died that we might live. No man who has lived and died for a worthy cause in this world has died in vain. When the body is racked with pain and the spirit has gone out, he goes on. The only way Marcel Hendricks and his companions may have died in vain is for us to continue to live unworthily. He continued. To him, the oath of office was a solemn obligation to the people of the county to uphold the majesty of the law. Reverend Hale's words are eerily prophetic, because if these men hadn't died in the way they did, I would not be making this documentary right now, and none of you watching this would know their names. In the Springfield News Leader, John Chapman wrote, on a sequestered slope in East Lawn Cemetery here last night slept Greene County's beloved Sheriff Marcel Hendricks. As they buried him there in the late afternoon, a brisk breeze blew from over the fields which he had worked and loved, and in the protection of which he died, symbol of the life which is done here and passes on to kinder climes. Maud was there with her children. Glenn was 20, Merle was 18, and little Maxine was only 9. After everything was over, Maud is said to have laid down by her husband. Then she went over and paused for a moment next to Sidney Meadows' grave, because he had just been buried. There was only one funeral left after that. Charlie Hauser. The final funeral was that of Charlie Hauser. His service was delayed because his widow Augusta was inconsolable. She had collapsed upon hearing the news and had yet to get out of bed. Charlie was from Joplin. After a significant delay, he had a service Wednesday afternoon at the First Baptist Church, and then his body was transported to Joplin. His casket was given a motorcycle escort. The services in Joplin were held at Hurlbut Chapel. Reverend Cliff Titus preached the service. The chapel was full to overflowing, with friends and family and just curious onlookers. Reverend Titus said that Hauser and his companions were members of a group of courageous officers throughout the country who, quote, are willing to give their lives in order that you and I may have a society in which the people are safe. A lot of important people went to Charlie's funeral. The mayor of Springfield, Police Chief Ed Waddell, the mayor of Joplin, Charles Patterson was there, various other commissioners. He was then taken to Forest Park Cemetery where he was laid to rest. We're going to go back to Monday, January 4th, and we're going back to Houston. Maybe you've forgotten about the Young brothers and where they are, but the police certainly haven't forgotten. And that Monday they were combing Houston looking for them. But it would be the efforts of one man who would solve the mystery for them. We're going to the home of J.L. Tomlinson. He lived at 4710 Walker Avenue. He was a carpenter. He and his wife made extra money by renting out the front bedroom of their home. They lived in a little green cottage. He was described as mild-mannered. And some weeks before, 2 men had knocked on his door wanting to rent that front room. One of them said his name was Claude Walker. But when he told them how much rent would be, they scoffed. That was too much. And they left. Now here it was 2 weeks later, and they're back. Oddly, though, this time, he insisted his name was Wallace. At first, Tomlinson just shrugged it off. He went with his wife to go play 42 with friends, and he got home that night around 10 o'clock. He got home and he sat down with a chronicle laid out before him, reading it before he went to bed. As he looked at it, he saw the picture of a man on the front page that looked familiar. He thought it was Claude Walker, and that man that he thought was Claude Walker had kept his hat on the whole time he was talking to him. He said he and his wife read every word in that paper that night about the young boys and what had happened in Missouri. He knew he had to tell police, but at the same time, he was terrified because he didn't want a bunch of people getting killed in his house. So that night, he didn't do anything. He just went to bed. He said he did not sleep hardly at all. And the next morning, he got up early and went to the police station. And that's where we're going to start our story next time. Thank you so much for joining me today. Sources I've used are We're Dead, Come On In by Bruce Davis, but most all of my research has come from newspaper articles from that time, and that's where Bruce Davis did most of his research as well. I've also been to the Greene County Archives to view their Young Brothers Massacre collection. I want to thank so many people. This episode in particular, I had a lot of people help me and be so welcoming. The folks over at the American Legion were kind enough to let me in and let me wander around and look at whatever I wanted. Same with folks over at the First Baptist Church, Grant Avenue Baptist Church, and the historic courthouse. Specifically, I'd like to thank Greene County Assessor Brent Johnson, who took time out of his day to help me figure out exactly where the sheriff's office had been. He found a map for me showing where every office was in that time period. Amazing. I'd like to thank David Eslick from the historic First Baptist Church of Springfield, Crystal Listerman from Grant Avenue Baptist Church for taking time out of her day to drive over and let me in. I also heavily use newspapers.com. Oh my goodness. So next time, we are going to talk about the downfall of the Young Brothers and the whole hullabaloo about getting them back home and getting them buried. Where will they be buried? Will they be assaulted by a mob when they get to town? How are they going to prevent that? And that will be it. I'm also going to tell you what happened to a lot of the people I've discussed because I've looked them up as I go. And sadly, some of them didn't live a whole lot longer after these events occurred. There's also a lot of reward money to go around. Who's going to get that? We'll discuss that too. I'll see you guys next time.